Thanks very much, folks. It is great to be here. What am I trying to do? I will zero in mostly on image of God thinking and what that means, and then look at this phenomenon of creatureliness, being creatures, what that means for us, and what's involved in Genesis 3 in the fall. What I'm trying to do is highlight some really important ideas and ones that I don't think get enough attention, honestly. They don't get enough attention in theology per se, but they don't get enough attention in our church and the kind of formation that churches offer. This is a sketch. It's suggestive. It's not definitive. And I hope it does open up the prospect of lots more things we need to think about together. In thinking about creation, you have to actually first think about God. You have to think about the nature and character of God. You have to think about that God as the triune God, Father, Son, and Spirit. The God who is life in himself gives life to others. And that sense of a giving God, a generous God, a God who out of his own determination and will and purpose shares life with something other than himself that he brings into being is a profound idea. So the idea of creation is as flowing from the generous, loving goodness of God shared with his creatures. There's no hint of violence, conflict, bloodshed, or death. Very common to the ancient Near Eastern origin stories was the idea that human beings are made to be slaves of the gods. And in terms of the biblical story, you couldn't have it more differently, right? It's absolutely the different story. You are made as a royal representative. And as we see in just a minute, the language that is used of human beings, even in the early chapters of Genesis, but throughout the Psalms, is all about human beings with royal language. Right? They are like the small k kings of creation. Right? There is a big K, capital K, king of creation, yes, but we're meant to be regents, so to speak. We're meant to be those who act on God's behalf as his representatives in the world. We are royal, right? Think of Psalm 8. Psalm 8, the language is all royal language to refer to human beings, right? So that's a totally different picture than being a slave of the gods. Absolutely a totally different picture. The place in creation is completely different. And so to be a slave is to be one who really has no agency. To be a royal representative has maximal agency on behalf of and under the authority of and for the sake of the one that you're representing. And that is a beautiful concept. It is really, really rich. So the Enuma Elish just draws stark contrasts in your mind, not only about the cosmology, but also about the anthropology. Totally different worlds, right? What world would you rather live in? What worldview actually makes for a good society? And I want to say there's been quite a lot of theological ink spilt over the idea of whether or not the biblical story is God-centered or man-centered, theocentric or anthropocentric. And some critics of Christianity really are on the warpath that it's the anthropocentrism of Christianity that is the source of its problem. But I think it's false. I actually think the story from beginning to end is God's story. It's the story about who God is, his purposes in the world, how he's going to accomplish those things. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, down to the atomic or subatomic level, all the way up to the biggest imaginable things. It's all the Lord's. The story is not actually about us. As human beings, we like to make the story about us, but it ain't. It's about God. It's God's story. So to keep a theocentric perspective is really, really important. The shocking thing, really, is what the New Testament comes to say about Jesus. That Jesus is actually the agent of creation. And there's vast implications for this, right, that we do not talk about. We don't talk about enough in theology. As a theologian, I can say that. And we don't talk about enough in church. And the way that creation and redemption are held together is in this one Jesus. It's in him as the creator, the agent of creation. So Jesus as the image bearer, the true image bearer, we're going to get to image bearing now, as Jesus is the true image of God, not in the image or as the image, but the image of God, the one in whom the exact representation of the being of God is found in human form, right, is the one who has been the agent of creation before all things, and the one in him all things hold together, and in him all things will be reconciled. It is all in Christ. Which makes you think, quite staggeringly, that from the very design, at the very beginning, before all time, in the triune life of God, it was the intention and purpose of the triune God to have Jesus come and live amongst us as a human being. So if you have, to use theological language, if you have the right Christology, you have a big enough one to encompass creation, redemption, and new creation all in one, all in him. Right? So the thing that continually startles me as a theologian is the more you think about the way that the story unfolds, the more Christ is the story through and through and through, all the time, in just surprising ways. An unavoidably, gloriously Christ-centered story it is, which is all the more amazing when you think about him as the image of God, which he said repeatedly in the New Testament to be. So not that there isn't mystery here, right? We will never get to the bottom of this God made flesh, right? But as an image bearer, I want you to think about that, right? The significant thing, if Jesus is the image of God and we are made in or as the image of God, the Hebrew can be translated really either way from the early chapters of Genesis. What it means is that the human being, humanness, finds its ultimate expression in this Jesus. And what he does for us, supremely in his bearing of the sins of the world, is to enable us to re-enter into proper relationship with God himself so that the image of God in us is renewed and restored. And there's, again, language that hints at that, particularly in Paul, but other places too, that's quite amazing language, right? That we, the image of God, is being restored in us as we become like him. So the story of our growth, and as alluded to, I've written on this question of spiritual formation, the end of spiritual formation, as we talk about it, is to become like Christ. So that way of thinking about what the story's about is pretty mind-boggling. The marvelous thing is this is a macro story, but it's a very personal story. It's the personal story of your destiny and mine, of your purpose and mine, your image bearing and mine in relationship to this Jesus, who is the true image, whose purpose in going through the suffering and death and resurrection is for the sake of our restoration as image bearers, so that we take up our rightful role in the world that has been designed from the beginning. So image bearing, human beings as intrinsically related to God and designed for loving fellowship or communion with God as his embodied representatives in his creation, as rational, social, and moral creatures, intrinsically related to God. I take the point about image bearing to be that whether you know it or not, whether you like it or not, whether you believe it or not, you and I and everyone else who's a human being lives in relationship to God. We are related to him by nature of our being. The source of our being comes from a God-given gift. Remember, it's within the loving communion of the triune God that out of his generosity, they share with us their own life so that we might enter into that life, so that we might partake of that life, right? So that it says eventually in the New Testament, become partakers of the divine nature. This is what being made in the image of God is for, right? And it gives us human purpose as his embodied representatives. So let me just say, embodied is really important. Let me just say, often as Christians, we've had a very shaky understanding of embodiedness. It's been like, it'd be really good if we kind of slough off these mortal bodies as soon as possible, right? And get on with the real thing of being spiritual beings. But that's not actually the biblical anthropology. It's that if we're embodied beings, it is precisely there that we are spiritual beings, spiritual hyphen embodied beings. You can't have one without the other. So embodiedness is going to be super important. Representatives is also an important word here. And this is my point about royalty, right? We're meant to be royal representatives. So to be made in the image of someone else implies that. But the role of an image bearer is really significant. So in the ancient world, we're meant to be royal representatives. So to be made in the image of someone else implies that. But the role of an image bearer is really significant. So in the ancient world, the way this works is that when temples were constructed for various gods, the pagan gods, that was meant to be a dwelling place for the god, right? And parallel story is the creation story is about the universe as the dwelling place for God, where he's going to live. And how is he going to be present? He's going to be present by the image of the God, which is us. In the ancient Near Eastern context, the image of the God was literally a statue made of wood or stone. And it was the last thing you put into the temple when you made a temple, right? And then there was a ceremony to animate that statue, that idol, right? This is how it works. So my ancient Near Eastern scholar friends love all these texts. They found all this. It's archaeologically there. It's just fantastically interesting. So the last thing you do is you put your idol in the temple, and then you animate it through a ceremony, including breathing upon it. There's a kind of parallel story in the Genesis story, right? If you think about it as the cosmos as a temple, as human beings now, as the image, not a statue. It's you and me. It's embodied and it's living. It's living as, in a sense, a piece of clay that has been breathed upon. Yes, how about that? Animated to perform the role of representing the God in the temple. And the way that this works in the ancient world is that they take these statues of the god and they put it around the geographical territory that marks out the territory for that god and for this people, right? So you see statues. So there are representatives of the god to mark the territory as his own. And that's what human beings are doing, made in the image of God as well, right? How are you to know that this is God's place? You're to look at human beings, right? Who are made in his image and who are animated by his spirit to be his people and his representative. Amazing. Consequently, there are certain capacities to image bearing and performing that function, you might say, in the world that are essential. So in the Genesis story, what you have clearly are rational beings. They are addressed by God. They are spoken to by God. They speak back to God. So there is a rational capacity that is essential to this, right? So these are the necessary capacities for performing the function. The emphasis is not upon the capacities, it's upon the function. Derivatively, you have to have some capacities. So rationality is one of those. Social beings, right? Social beings, it's not good that you're alone. There is a shared life together. There is the idea of being fruitful and multiplying, which of course is being blessed for the sake of future generations and carrying on, right? And moral beings, right? They clearly are responsible and accountable beings who are addressed with the word of God and who then default from that word. I want to invite you to think of yourself as a creature. How often do we think about ourselves as creatures? It seems like the early chapters of Genesis are really at pains to point out that we are co-creatures with the rest of the land animals. We don't get a day to ourselves. We get a day with the rest of the land animals. We are co-creatures. So we have a unique relationship, you might say, vertically with God on behalf of God as his representatives that others do not have because of capacities that we have that other creatures don't have, yes. But that doesn't cancel out, to use a point I think Norman Wurzba makes, that doesn't cancel out the verticality doesn't cancel out the horizontal nature that we're just co-creatures. We're six-day creatures along with cattle. What happens in Genesis 3 is a rebellion against creatureliness. It's a refusal to be a creature. It's a refusal to live as the recipient of divine gifts. It's a refusal to live within the order that has been put there by God. So it's a default against creatureliness in a fundamental sense. and the urge to be something we're not, to be God-like, right? To take the place of God in defining good and evil for ourselves. And the tree is at the center, and the center is the limit, says Bonhoeffer, which is a profound insight, to keep us from making ourselves the center of the story, to make sure that we position ourselves as creatures of God who are dependent upon God, who are the recipients of gifts, and whose job is to share those gifts with one another for the sustenance of life and the goodness of all creation, right? That's at the heart of the story, right? So if a default against creatureliness is the heart of the story, it puts us by nature into the position of usurpers, right? What we are in the fallen world is usurpers of divine prerogatives. What we want is to be the center of the story when we're not the center of the story. We want to displace God from the center, like those baskets are at the center of your table, and put ourselves at the center of the story, right? That's what's going on. I think that's a really important insight.